The door sealed, and Cathy Ramirez understood two things at the exact same moment. The first was that there was no handle on the inside. The second was that the man standing behind her had known that before they ever walked in. She was trapped underground with Cillian Pisani, the most dangerous man in the city, the subject of her most sensitive investigation, and the only person alive who currently held the code to the door between her and the rest of the world. This was not how tonight was supposed to go. 40 minutes earlier, she had been the smartest person in the room. Now she was not even sure she was the safest person in it. A charity gala, a bunker, one exit, no signal, and a mafia boss who had not said a single unnecessary word since they left the ballroom, which, if her 4 months of research had taught her anything, meant he was thinking. Men like Cillian Pisani did not go quiet because they had nothing to say. They went quiet because whatever they were calculating did not yet need to be spoken out loud. That distinction mattered. She had learned, in this line of work, to pay very close attention to the distinctions. The night had started the way all the worst nights do, reasonably. The Belmont Grand's annual gala was the kind of event that required 3 different levels of invitation, a background check that took 2 weeks, and an evening dress that cost more than Cathy's monthly rent. She had managed all 3, which said less about her personal finances and more about how far she was willing to go for a story. She had spent 4 months building toward tonight. 4 months of carefully placed sources, borrowed access, and late nights reading financial disclosures in languages she had to have partially translated. Tonight was supposed to be the night she finally got close enough to see behind the curtain. What she had not factored into that plan was that someone else had chosen tonight to set the curtain on fire. She heard the first shot before she understood what it was. That is almost always how it works in real life. The brain refuses to accept the most dangerous explanation until the evidence makes refusal impossible. By the time she registered the sound for what it was, the north wall of the ballroom had already come apart. The chandeliers were swinging wildly on their fittings, and 400 people in formal wear had collectively decided that the exit was more important than the dinner. The grip on her wrist came without warning, firm, sure, and entirely without apology. "Move." The voice landed just behind her left ear, low and steady in a way that made no logical sense given that the room was, by every available measure, falling apart around them. "Not when you are ready. Now." She knew that voice before she turned. She had spent 4 months learning it from recordings and second-hand accounts and court documents that had a strange habit of going nowhere. Cillian Pisani, the man her editor called untouchable, the man the city's federal task force had 3 open files on and 0 convictions. 41 years old, built like someone who had never once in his life had reason to hurry, and currently pulling her through a service corridor she had not noticed, because it was specifically designed not to be noticed. "Where are you taking me?" She pulled against his hold, not enough to break it, but enough to make the point that she was not simply going to be moved around like luggage. He did not slow down. "Somewhere that is not up there." He said it without looking back at her, navigating the corridor with the ease of a man who had walked it in the dark. "The men upstairs are Varro's syndicate. They came for a specific purpose tonight." A brief pause. "And you have spent 4 months in my vicinity, which means they have almost certainly seen your face alongside mine." She processed that. "So, I am in danger because of you." "You are in danger because of the story you chose to write." He glanced back at her then, just once, just long enough. "I did not ask to be the subject of it." She opened her mouth. He stopped walking, pressed his palm flat against a panel in the wall, and a door exhaled open in front of them. A long, pressurized release of air that sounded almost like relief. Beyond it was a corridor, narrow and low-ceilinged, with walls that had been stripped back to their bones and lighting that was pale and institutional and unkind. At the far end was another door, heavier, older-looking, the kind that suggested permanence. He stepped through. She hesitated for exactly 3 seconds, which was all the time it took for the sound of gunfire above them to remind her that the alternative to going through that door was going back up the stairs. She went through. The second door sealed behind her with a sound she felt in her back teeth. A deep, pressurized finality that meant the corridor was now behind them, and the world above was now a separate problem. The space beyond was small, not impossibly so, but enough to be conscious of. Emergency lighting ran amber along the base of the walls. The air was cool and recycled, and carried no smell of anything human, which was the kind of detail that told her this room had been sitting sealed and ready for exactly this kind of occasion. She turned back to the door immediately, pressed the handle. Nothing. Tried it again, shoulder into it. Still nothing. She looked left, a keypad backlit waiting. She reached for it. That requires a 12-digit sequence that resets every 4 hours. Cillian had not moved from where he stood. His voice was the most relaxed thing in the room. I am the only person in here who has it. She turned around slowly and looked at him. He looked back at her with eyes that gave away nothing, and a posture that suggested he had all the time in the world, which, she was beginning to understand, was exactly the problem. You knew about my investigation. It was not a question. She had already worked that out upstairs. She needed to hear him say it. Since your 3rd week, he said it without any particular feeling attached to it. You are considerably better at this than most people who have attempted it. You still made 4 mistakes I could identify without having to think about them. He let that land. I chose not to act on any of them. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the kind of silence that has weight, the kind that presses on the ears and makes the space feel smaller than it already is. Why? She finally asked. He studied her face for a moment with the focused, dispassionate attention of someone reading a document they have not decided how to respond to yet. The corner of his mouth shifted, not enough to be called a smile, but enough to suggest that the answer to her question was considerably more complicated than either of them wanted to deal with right now. That, he said quietly, is going to be a long conversation. He glanced once at the sealed door, then back at her. It appears we are not short on time. Cathy had interviewed a man on death row once. She had sat across from him in a room with no windows and a door she could hear being locked from the outside, and she had asked him how it felt to know that the walls around him were permanent. He had looked at her for a long moment before answering. It is not the walls, he had said. It is the quiet. The quiet is what tells you that nobody is coming. She understood that now in a way she had not then. The bunker was not loud. That was the thing that settled over her first, not fear, not anger, but the sheer, pressing weight of the silence. Above them, somewhere beyond reinforced concrete and sealed steel, a war was happening. She knew that logically. She had heard it with her own ears not 10 minutes ago. But down here there was nothing. No vibration in the floor, no muffled percussion of gunfire bleeding through the walls. Just the low, mechanical hum of the ventilation system running its quiet cycle, and the sound of her own breathing, which she was now uncomfortably aware of. Cillian had moved to the far side of the room. He had removed his jacket, not frantically, not with any visible urgency, but with the same methodical composure he seemed to apply to everything, and draped it over the back of the single chair near the wall. He was checking something on the interior panel beside the secondary door. His back was to her. He had not looked at her in the last 4 minutes, which she was cataloging carefully because that was what she did when she did not know what else to do. She cataloged. She observed. She built a picture from the details other people did not think they were giving away. What the details were giving away right now was that Cillian Pisani was not panicked. He was not even particularly concerned. And that, more than the locked door or the absent signal or the recycled air, was the most unsettling thing in the room. There is water in the lower cabinet. He said it without turning around. And a medical kit if you need one. You have a cut on your left hand, probably from the glass in the ballroom. She looked down. He was right. A thin line across her palm already dried. She had not felt it happen. I am fine, she said. I did not ask if you were fine. I told you where the medical kit was. She crossed to the cabinet, opened it, and found exactly what he said she would. She wrapped her hand in silence, taking her time with it, using the moment to study the room properly. It was not large. Perhaps the size of a generous office, long rather than wide, with a low ceiling that did not quite allow for comfort and walls that were bare except for the control panels and a single shelf stocked with the kind of supplies that told her this space had been assembled by someone who planned for worst-case scenarios as a professional habit. Water, medical supplies, 2 emergency blankets still sealed in their packaging. A shelf of what appeared to be non-perishable rations that she genuinely hoped were not going to become relevant. 1 door in, no windows, no alternative. "How long have you had this?" she asked. Cillian turned from the panel. 7 years. "You built an underground bunker beneath a hotel ballroom 7 years ago." "I did not build it beneath a hotel ballroom." He moved to the table in the center of the room and sat down, unhurried. "The ballroom was built above it. There is a distinction." She stared at him. "That is not a comforting distinction." "It was not meant to comfort you. It was meant to be accurate." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat. Not because she wanted to sit across from him, because standing made her feel like she was waiting for something, and she was not going to let this man watch her wait. She set her hands flat on the table and looked at him directly, which was something she had practiced, the ability to hold a difficult subject's gaze without blinking first. Most people broke within the first 8 seconds. Cillian did not appear to have a clock on the matter at all. He simply looked back at her, patient and unreadable, like a man who had been on the receiving end of this exact technique before and found it mildly interesting at best. "You said I made 4 mistakes," she said, "in my investigation." "I did." "Tell me what they were." Something moved behind his eyes, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "Why would I do that?" "Because we are going to be down here for a while, and I would rather spend that time having an honest conversation than sitting in silence pretending we are not exactly who we both know we are." She held his gaze. "You know I am a journalist. I know you are not a legitimate businessman. We are past the part where either of us performs." He was quiet for a moment. The ventilation hummed. Somewhere in the ceiling above them, a pipe ticked once and then went still. "Your first mistake," he said slowly, "was using the same car twice outside my building on Caraway Street." He leaned back slightly in the chair. "Your second was trusting a source whose name I already owned before you ever found him." He paused. "Do you want the other too?" She kept her expression exactly where it was. "I want all of it." "I know you do." He looked at her with those flat, dark eyes that told her nothing and somehow said everything. "That is exactly what concerns me about you, Miss Ramirez." The ventilation hummed. The silence held. And Cathy understood, settling into the hard reality of that chair, that she was not just trapped with the subject of her investigation. She was trapped with a man who had been watching her conduct it. Every step, every mistake, every move she thought she had made cleanly. The question that now sat at the center of everything, the one she did not yet have the nerve to ask out loud, was very simple. If he had known about her for 4 months and had chosen to do nothing, then what exactly had he been waiting for? There is a particular kind of person who responds to confinement by going still. They absorb the reality of their situation, adjust their expectations accordingly, and redirect their energy toward whatever limited options remain available. Cathy had interviewed enough of them to recognize the type. She had always quietly respected it as a survival strategy. She was not that kind of person. 20 minutes after the door sealed, she was on her feet again. Not packing, she refused to pace, because packing was what people did when they had already accepted that they were stuck, and she had not accepted anything yet. She was moving with purpose. There was a difference, and the difference mattered to her even if it was not immediately obvious to anyone watching. Cillian was watching. She ignored him and worked the room systematically, the way she worked every unfamiliar space, starting at the door and moving clockwise. She pressed her hands along the seam of the main entrance, feeling for any variation in the frame, any panel she might have missed the first time. There was nothing. She moved to the secondary door at the far end, the one Cillian had been examining earlier, and tried that handle, locked from the other side. She crouched and looked at the gap beneath it, barely a centimeter. Enough for air, not enough for anything useful. She straightened and pulled out her phone. No signal, same as before. She held it up anyway, moving it slowly across different areas of the room the way people do when they know it will not work but need to confirm it for themselves. One bar flickered briefly near the upper left corner of the room, then vanished before she could act on it. There is a communication panel on the north wall. Cillian had not moved from the table. His voice was even, his posture unchanged, a man narrating her search to her from a seated position, which she found genuinely irritating. It operates on a closed internal frequency. It will not connect you to anyone outside. Then what is it for? Communicating with my security team, if any of them are still in a position to receive. He said the second part without any particular emotion attached to it, which told her the possibility that they were not was one he had already sat with and set aside. She crossed to the panel. It was mounted flush with the wall, a grid of small switches and a single speaker grill, the kind of setup that looked governmental and old and entirely analog, which she suspected was intentional. Analog systems could not be remotely hacked. She had written a piece on that 3 years ago for the Tribune's tech column, filling space between her real investigations, and she had thought nothing of it at the time. She thought about it now. She pressed the transmit switch. Static. She tried 3 different frequencies, more static, and then, on the 4th, something that might have been a voice beneath the interference, too broken to read, present just long enough to confirm that the world above them had not entirely gone away. "Someone is on that frequency," she said. "I know." Cillian was on his feet now. She had not heard him move, which should not have been possible given the size of the room, but somehow was. He was beside her before she had fully registered that he had stood up, close enough that she could feel the change in the air between them. He reached past her and pressed the transmit switch himself, held it for 4 seconds in a specific rhythm. 2 short, 1 long, 1 short. Then he released it and waited. 8 seconds of static. Then the same pattern came back through the speaker, faint but deliberate. He stepped back. Something in his posture shifted, not relief exactly, but a fractional release of something he had been carrying since the door sealed. "2 of my men are in position on the upper level. They are holding." "Holding what?" "The stairwell." He moved back to the table. "Which means the lower corridor is still secure and the people upstairs have not yet reached this floor." He pulled out the chair and sat with the calm of a man settling in for a long wait. "Which means we are not in immediate danger. We are simply contained." Cathy turned back to the panel. She pressed the transmit switch again, this time holding it in a different pattern, 3 short bursts, the international distress signal that every journalist learned in their first field safety training and prayed they would never need to use. She held the switch, counted, released. Nothing came back. "That will not reach anyone outside the building." Cillian said it without looking up. "The frequency is internally bounded, architectural shielding in the walls." "I understood what you said the first time." She pressed the switch again anyway, because sometimes signals found gaps that calculations did not account for. Because 4 months of this investigation had taught her that the official version of what was possible was almost never the complete version. Because standing still felt like surrendering something she was not prepared to surrender yet. She felt his hand close around her wrist. Not the grip from the ballroom, that one had been about urgency. This one was different. It was firm and deliberate and entirely without hurry, the kind of hold that was less about stopping her movement and more about redirecting her attention. She turned. He was standing again, closer than she had realized. Close enough that she could see the faint line of tension along his jaw that his expression was working hard not to show, and the way his eyes had shifted from patient to something considerably more direct. "Stop resisting." His voice was quiet, not unkind, but absolute in the way that very few things in her life had ever been absolute. "There is no frequency you can reach from this room that I have not already tried. There is no exit in this space that I do not already know about. And there is no version of the next several hours that does not require you to accept one single fact." He held her gaze without blinking. "In here, I am the only thing keeping you alive, not your instincts. Not your training, not whatever you have written about me in that notebook." A pause that lasted exactly long enough. "Me." She looked at his hand on her wrist. She looked at his face. She thought about arguing. She had the words assembled and ready because she always did. But something in the quality of his certainty stopped her. Not the certainty itself. She had been in rooms with arrogant men her entire career, and arrogance had never once given her pause. What stopped her was the specific texture of what he was saying. It did not sound like control. It sounded, underneath everything, like something closer to concern. And that was the detail her journalist's instinct caught and filed away quietly, because it was the kind of detail that changed the shape of a story entirely. She pulled her wrist back slowly. He let go without resistance. "Fine," she said at once, cleanly. "But the moment that door can be opened, you open it." He looked at her for a moment longer than the exchange required. "The moment that door can be opened," he said carefully, "will depend entirely on what we find on the other side of it." He turned back to the table. "Sit down, Miss Ramirez. We have a long night ahead of us, and I need you thinking clearly, not running on adrenaline." She sat, not because he told her to. Because he was right, and being right about something she did not want to admit was, in her experience, the most irritating thing another person could do to you. Time moves differently underground. Without windows, without the natural shift of light that the human brain uses to measure the passage of hours, time becomes a feeling rather than a fact. Cathy had read that once in a psychology journal she had pulled for a piece on solitary confinement, that subjects kept in artificially lit, windowless environments for extended periods began to lose their sense of duration within as little as 3 hours. At the time, she had found it academically interesting. Now, sitting across a bare table from Cillian Pisani with no clock on the wall and no signal on her phone, she found it considerably more personal. She guessed they had been down here close to 2 hours. She could have been wrong by 40 minutes in either direction and had no way of knowing. Cillian had been quiet for most of it. Not the uncomfortable quiet of a man with nothing to say, the deliberate quiet of a man who had decided that whatever he was thinking was not yet ready to be spoken. He had checked the communication panel twice more. The return signal from his men upstairs had come back both times, same pattern, which meant the stairwell was holding and the immediate threat had not moved. He had reported this to her each time without being asked, which she noted. A man who wanted her frightened and compliant would have kept that information to himself. "You could have had me removed," she said. She had not planned to open with that. But 2 hours of quiet had a way of pulling things out of the part of the mind where you kept the questions you were not sure you were ready to ask. 4 months ago, when you first identified me, you had options that did not involve letting me continue. Cillian looked up from the table. "I had several options. And you chose none of them." "I chose one of them." He held her gaze steadily. "I chose to wait." "For what?" He was quiet for a moment, in that particular way of his that was less hesitation and more considered packing. A man who never spent a word he had not already decided was worth spending. "I wanted to see what you were actually looking for," he said finally. "Most journalists who come near my name are looking for a headline, something loud, something that photographs well and moves quickly and does not require them to understand anything they are writing about." He paused. "You were not doing that." "What was I doing?" "You were trying to understand something." He said it without flattery, as a plain observation. "That is rarer than you might think, and considerably more dangerous." He turned the empty water cup on the table between his palms, a small, almost unconscious movement that she catalogued immediately as the first fidget she had seen from him. "Dangerous for you, specifically." "Because understanding you is dangerous." "Because understanding anything accurately in this city is dangerous." He set the cup down. "The people who get hurt are almost never the ones looking for scandal. They are the ones who get close enough to see the actual structure of things, the architecture underneath." He looked at her. "That is what you were doing. I could see it in the questions you were asking, the sequence of them." Cathy absorbed that. There was something in the way he spoke about her investigation, not with hostility, not with the clipped defensiveness of a man protecting himself, but with something that sat uncomfortably close to respect, that she did not know what to do with yet. She filed it away and moved to the next question, the one that had been sitting at the back of her mind since Chapter 1. "The ghost," she said. "That is what they call you, your own people included." Something shifted in his face. Not much, enough. "Yes." "You chose that name." "Names choose themselves," he said. "You simply decide whether to correct them or not." He was quiet for a moment. A ghost is something that was once present and is no longer, something that moves through spaces without leaving a mark. I found it accurate. Accurate to what? He looked at the table for a moment before answering. My family were not always what I became. He said it without theater, without the careful packaging of a man managing his narrative. He said it the way people say things they have carried alone for long enough that the weight of holding it has become more exhausting than the vulnerability of putting it down. My father ran a legitimate shipping operation out of Naples, mid-sized, respectable. The kind of business that does not make anyone very rich, but keeps everyone fed and does not require anyone to look over their shoulder on the way home. A pause. He had a partner, a man he had worked beside for 11 years, who he trusted beyond the point that trust should ever go without verification. Cathy did not move. She had conducted enough interviews to know when a person had reached the edge of something real, and that any movement, any sound, any shift in posture could interrupt the passage of it. The partner had debts, Cillian continued, the kind that attract specific kinds of creditors. He resolved those debts by selling information about my father's roots to the people those roots were inconvenient for. He turned the cup again once. My father was 53. My mother was with him. They were returning from a dinner to celebrate their anniversary when the car was run off a coastal road outside Salerno. He stopped. The partner attended the funeral. He stood beside me at the graveside and told me they were like family to him. The ventilation hummed. The amber light held everything in its flat, unchanging glow. How old were you? Cathy asked quietly. 22. He said it without asking for anything, no sympathy, no response. He simply placed the number in the room and left it there. Old enough to understand exactly what had happened, young enough to respond to it very badly. Is that when it started? That is when I stopped being someone who could leave clean marks on anything. He looked at her directly then, and for the first time since the door sealed, she saw something behind those flat, dark eyes that was not calculation. It was old. It was settled. It was the specific expression of a man who had made a decision about himself a very long time ago and had not revisited it since. You cannot build what I have built and remain the kind of person who is safe to be near. I understood that early. I made my peace with it. So the ghost is not a reputation, she said slowly. It is a sentence you gave yourself. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that she could not name quickly enough to hold on to. You said you wanted to understand the structure of things, Miss Ramirez. His voice was quieter than it had been all evening. Be careful that you do not understand more than you came prepared to carry. She held his gaze. I have been a journalist for 9 years. I have never once put down a story because it got heavy. He studied her face with the same focused, dispassionate attention he had turned on her in the ballroom, in the corridor, across this table. But something in the quality of it had shifted, almost imperceptibly, the way barometric pressure shifts before weather that has not yet announced itself. No, he said quietly, I do not imagine you have. The ventilation cycled. Somewhere above them, 2 men were holding a stairwell. The world outside continued its business without them. And in the amber stillness of the bunker, something that had been sealed considerably longer and considerably tighter than any door in the room had developed, without either of them choosing it, its first visible crack. She found it by accident. She had gone back to the supply cabinet, not to search it, but because sitting across from Cillian in the wake of everything he had just said felt like standing too close to something that had not yet decided whether it was going to burn. She needed something to do with her hands. The cabinet gave her a reason to have them occupied. The bottle was at the back of the lower shelf, behind the emergency rations and a folded thermal blanket. Dark glass, no label on the front, sealed with wax the color of old burgundy. She pulled it out and turned it over. A small paper tag was tied to the neck with twine, handwritten in ink that had faded to the color of weak tea. The year was still legible. It was older than she had expected by a significant margin. There is a bottle of scotch in here, she said. It is either very good or very old, possibly both. Cillian looked up from the communication panel. He studied the bottle from across the room for a moment with an expression she could not immediately categorize. I put that there 4 years ago, he said, "for a specific occasion." "What occasion?" "The kind that has not happened yet." He held her gaze briefly. "Until tonight, I had hoped it would stay that way." She looked at the bottle. She looked at him. She set it on the table between them. "I think tonight qualifies." He did not argue. He found 2 cups in the upper cabinet, the same plain, functional cups they had been using for water, and set them beside the bottle without ceremony. She broke the wax seal herself, which seemed to briefly surprise him, though he recovered quickly. The scotch poured the color of dark amber, which struck her as fitting given the lighting, and filled the small space with a smell that was warm and slightly smoky and entirely out of place in a room designed for emergencies. She lifted her cup. He lifted his. Neither of them offered a toast, because there was nothing appropriate to toast to, and they were both sensible enough to know it. The first sip hit the back of her throat with the slow, unhurried heat of something that had been waiting a very long time to be opened. She exhaled. Across the table, Cillian set his cup down and looked at it for a moment the way a person looks at something they have been putting off feeling. "Your turn," he said. She looked up. "My turn for what?" "You have had 3 hours of mine." He leaned back slightly in the chair, arms loose, the posture of a man making a deliberate effort toward something that did not come naturally to him. "I told you about Naples, about my father, about choices I have not discussed with anyone who is still living." He said the last part without drama, as a simple logistical observation. "That is not a thing I do." "I noticed," she said. "Then you understand that the exchange has been somewhat uneven." He looked at her evenly. "What are you actually looking for, Cathy?" It was the first time he had used her name. Not Miss Ramirez, not the journalist, not a pronoun. Her name, spoken with the same quiet precision he applied to everything, landed differently than she had prepared for. She took another sip to cover the beat she needed to collect herself. "Justice," she said. Then, more honestly, because the scotch was warm and the hour was late and pretending to be simpler than she was had always been something she was bad at. "I do not know if that is still true. It was true when I started." "What changed?" "You are more complicated than the file I built on you." She said it plainly. "That is inconvenient." Something crossed his face that was almost a smile. "I apologize for the inconvenience." "No, you do not." "No," he agreed. "I do not." She turned the cup slowly between her palms. The second pour went down easier than the first, the way second pours always do when the conversation has reached the kind of territory that makes the edges of things feel slightly less sharp. She was not drunk. She was too conscious of the room and the situation and the man across from her for the alcohol to do more than take the outermost layer off the evening. But it had done something to the air between them, thinned it somehow. Made the careful professional distance they had both been maintaining feel slightly more like a decision that required active effort to sustain. "The story I wrote about you in my head," she said, "was very clean, very clear." She looked at him across the table. "The villain has a clear motive, a clear method, and a clear absence of anything that complicates the verdict. That is the story that wins awards. And the story you are writing now is considerably messier." She held his gaze. "And considerably more true." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, not abruptly, but with a certain shift of energy that changed the quality of the room. He moved around the table slowly, not toward her exactly, but not away from her either. He stopped at the edge of the table beside her, close enough that the space between them required a conscious acknowledgement from both of them. He reached past her and set his cup down on the cabinet behind her chair, and for one suspended moment, the distance between them was the distance of a held breath, close enough to feel the warmth of another person, far enough that nothing had been crossed. He did not move away immediately, neither did she. "Cillian," she said his name for the first time, not as a journalist addressing a subject, as one person acknowledging another in a small room where all the usual armor had been quietly, incrementally removed over the course of a very long night. He looked down at her with those dark eyes that had spent the entire evening giving away nothing, and she watched something move through them that he did not try to stop quickly enough. It was brief. It was unguarded. It was the single most honest thing she had seen on his face since the door sealed. Then he straightened, stepped back, picked up the bottle from the table and returned it to the cabinet with the same methodical composure that was his most reliable defense against the world. "You should sleep," he said. His voice was level, almost. "One of us needs to be rested when that door opens, and it is not going to be me." She looked at the space where he had just been standing. She thought about saying something and decided against it. Some moments were complete exactly as they were, without the addition of words that would only make them smaller. She pulled the thermal blanket from the shelf, settled into the chair, and closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time. Across the room, she could hear him breathing, steady and controlled, the same as always, and she had the distinct, unsettling sense that he was not asleep either. She was not sure what pulled her out of the thin, restless half-sleep she had finally managed. It was not a loud sound. It was the absence of one. The steady, controlled rhythm of Cillian's breathing that she had been unconsciously tracking across the room had changed, shortened, sharpened, and somewhere beneath the level of conscious thought, her brain had registered the difference and pulled her back to the surface. She opened her eyes. The amber lighting was unchanged. The ventilation hummed its same low note. Everything in the room was exactly as she had left it, except that Cillian, who had been seated at the table when she closed her eyes, was now slumped forward against it, one hand flat on the surface and the other pressed against his left side, in the specific, deliberate way of a person managing pain they have decided not to advertise. She was on her feet before she had fully decided to move. "You are hurt," she said it as she crossed the room, not as an accusation, simply as the first fact that needed to be established. "It is manageable." His voice was controlled but had lost something, some layer of its usual even quality, worn down to something rower underneath. He did not look up. "You have been managing it since the ballroom." She crouched beside the chair and looked at his hand pressed to his ribs. The evening shirt beneath it was darker on the left side than it should have been, and had been for some time, she now realized. She thought back to the corridor. The way he had moved, slightly angled, favoring the right. The way he had sat consistently with his left arm resting on the table rather than at his side. She had catalogued it without understanding it, the way you sometimes collect details before you know what they mean. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because there was nothing to say." He lifted his head then, and she saw it, the effort the composure was costing him. His face was pale beneath its usual steadiness, and there was a tightness around his eyes that had not been there an hour ago. "It is a graze." The bleeding slowed. "Let me see it." "Cathy." "Cillian." She used his name with the same quiet precision he had used hers an hour ago, and watched it land with the same effect. "The medical kit is 2 feet away. Let me see it." He held her gaze for a moment that lasted slightly longer than resistance and slightly shorter than refusal. Then he moved his hand. The graze was along his lower left ribs, long rather than deep, the kind of wound that a few inches of different geometry would have made into something neither of them would have walked away from. It had bled considerably and then slowed, but the movement of the last several hours had kept it from closing properly. She retrieved the medical kit, opened it on the table beside him, and worked in silence, cleaning, pressing, covering, with the focused efficiency of someone who had done enough field reporting in enough difficult places to have learned basic wound care out of pure professional necessity. He sat very still through all of it. Still in the way he was still for everything, not passively, but with active, deliberate control, as though stillness was something he had trained for rather than something that came naturally. It was when she leaned closer to secure the dressing that she saw them. The shirt had come untucked slightly on his right side, and what she saw there was not the unmarked skin of a man who had lived carefully. There were 2 scars, old ones, long settled into silver-white lines that had clearly once been serious. One ran diagonally across his ribs. The other was smaller, higher, just below his shoulder blade. Neither had been treated by anyone who had taken their time about it. She did not say anything. She finished securing the dressing and sat back. "The one on the ribs," he said quietly without her asking. He had seen her see them. "Marseille, I was 26. Still learning which rooms were safe to walk into and which were not." A pause. I learned quickly after that. And the other one. He was quiet for a moment. That one I gave myself. He said it plainly, without apology, looking at the table. Not intentionally. I went through a window on the second floor of a building in Genoa. The glass was older than it looked. He exhaled slowly, carefully, conscious of his ribs. I was retrieving something that belonged to my father, documents the partner had taken when he cleared his debts. His jaw tightened briefly. I was 23. I had not yet learned to check a window frame before I committed to it. Did you get the documents? He looked at her. Yes. What happened to the partner? The question settled between them. He held her gaze for a measured moment, and she understood from the quality of his silence that the answer was not something he was going to give her, and that she already knew it anyway. The fever dream, she said quietly, almost to herself. He tilted his head slightly. What? Something my grandmother used to say. She began returning items to the medical kit, giving her hands something to do. She said that every person carries a fever dream, the version of events that broke their temperature and rewrote everything that came after it. The moment the world stopped being the shape they thought it was. She closed the kit and looked at him. Naples was yours. He studied her face in the amber light with an expression she was beginning to learn, the one that meant he was deciding how honest to be, weighing the cost of it. Naples was the fever, he said finally. What came after was the dream, the version of myself I built in the wreckage of it. He looked at his hands on the table. The ghost is not a man, Cathy. He is a decision I made when I was 22 years old and had nothing left to lose and no one left to disappoint. He paused. That kind of decision has a way of becoming permanent before you understand it was ever a choice. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, above them, the world was still doing whatever it was doing. The communication panel had been silent for the last hour, which Cillian had told her meant his men were conserving transmissions, a good sign, not a bad one. She had chosen to believe him. You are not what I wrote in my notebook, she said. No, his voice was quieter than she had heard it. I imagine I am not. That does not make you innocent. I know that. He looked at her steadily. I have never asked anyone to call me innocent. I would not know what to do with it. She looked at the scars she could no longer see beneath the dressing and the shirt. She thought about a 22-year-old standing at a graveside in Salerno, beside the man who had arranged the grave. She thought about what a person builds when the architecture of their life is taken apart at that particular age, in that particular way, by that particular kind of betrayal. She thought about whether the structure they build in its place could ever be called, in any honest language, entirely their own fault. She did not arrive at a clean answer. She was beginning to suspect that was the point. Sleep, she said, standing. You have a graze on your ribs and you have been upright for hours. Sleep. She moved back to her chair, pulled the thermal blanket around her shoulders and settled in. I will watch the panel. A silence. Then, from across the room, quiet enough that she almost missed it, thank you. It was 2 words. Small, unadorned, and entirely without the careful management he applied to everything else he said. She did not respond, because a response would have made it smaller. She simply sat in the amber quiet, watched the communication panel, and listened to his breathing gradually, incrementally, for the first time all night, slow into something that was almost rest. She heard it first. Not a loud sound, nothing so straightforward as that. It was a change in the quality of the ventilation. A slight fluctuation in the hum, like a note played on an instrument that had just gone fractionally out of tune. She had been sitting with it for 30 seconds before she understood that it was not the system cycling. It was the system straining. Cillian. She was already on her feet when she said it. He was awake before she crossed the room. Not the slow, disoriented surfacing of a man pulled from deep sleep, but the immediate, complete alertness of someone who had spent years sleeping in rooms where the difference between resting and ready was a liability he could not afford. He was upright, eyes clear, hand instinctively moving to the left side of his jacket, before he registered that whatever had been there before the gala was no longer available to him. The ventilation, she said. He heard it immediately. She watched his attention sharpen in a way that was almost physical, a visible reorganization of everything in his posture. He crossed to the north wall panel in 4 strides, and pulled the cover off the secondary display she had not noticed before, recessed behind the primary communication grid. It was a systems monitor. Small screen, green backlit text, the kind of interface that had been designed for function with no concession whatsoever to ease of use. He read it faster than she could follow, his jaw set. Someone is on the exterior ventilation access. His voice was completely level, which she had learned by now was not reassurance. It was concentration. Upper service panel, north side of the building. They are manually overriding the filtration sequence. She absorbed that. Can they pump something through? Not quickly. The system has internal buffers. He was already working the panel, pressing through a sequence of inputs with the focused speed of a man who had memorized this interface specifically so that he would never have to think about it under pressure. But if they bypass the buffers, which they will be attempting to do, we have somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes before the air quality in here becomes a problem. How big a problem? He glanced at her briefly, the kind that does not leave time for discussion afterward. She took one measured breath and made the decision to be useful rather than frightened, because frightened was a state she could not afford and usefulness was something she could control. Tell me what you need. The secondary door. He nodded toward the far end of the room without looking away from the panel. There is a manual bypass for the lock on the interior frame, a recessed lever, left side, approximately knee height. I need it disengaged without triggering the external alarm on the other side of the door. How do I disengage it without triggering the alarm? The lever has two positions. Quarter turn opens the lock. Half turn opens the lock and announces it to whatever is on the other side. He finally looked at her directly. You want the quarter turn. Slow. Do not push past the resistance point. She was already moving. She found the lever exactly where he said, recessed into the frame, painted the same gray as the wall, invisible unless you knew to look. She crouched, got both hands on it, and turned it with the careful deliberateness of someone diffusing something. The resistance came at about 30 degrees. She held it there, breathing evenly, and felt, rather than heard, the lock disengage in a way that had no drama to it whatsoever, which was exactly what she needed. Done, she said. Do not open it yet. She stayed where she was. Behind her, the sound of the ventilation continued its altered rhythm, slightly labored now, like breathing through a cloth. The system's monitor on the panel was emitting a low, intermittent tone that Cillian was working steadily to silence, navigating through override sequences she could not follow from across the room. There is a mole, he said. He said it with the flatness of a man confirming something he had suspected for long enough that the confirmation was more settling than shocking. The exterior access panel on the north side requires a 6-digit staff code. The Varro Syndicate does not have my staff codes. He pressed a final sequence, and the monitor tone cut out. Someone inside gave it to them. How many people have that code? Had. He corrected the tense without inflection, and the correction said everything that needed to be said about what would follow. 7. 2 of them are currently holding the stairwell upstairs. The others, he stopped. She heard the thing he was not finishing and understood that this was not the moment to press him toward it. What is on the other side of that door? She asked instead. A service corridor, 40 feet long. It branches left into the utility sublevel and right toward the parking structure. He closed the panel cover and turned to face the room with the expression of a man doing rapid, unsentimental calculations. The parking structure connects to the street through a vehicle ramp. It is not a clean exit, but it is an exit. And between here and there. Potentially nothing. Potentially the people who just compromised my ventilation system, who have had approximately the same amount of time to move as we have had to have this conversation. He crossed to the cabinet, opened it, and retrieved 2 items from the lower shelf, a torch and something else she could not immediately identify until he turned. It was compact, dark, and he handled it with the practiced ease of something familiar. She had not known it was in the cabinet. She suspected there were a number of things in this room she had not been told about. You kept a weapon in the supply cabinet, she said. I keep a weapon in most places. He said it without apology. It is less a habit and more a philosophy. She looked at the secondary door, then at him. If the corridor is clear, we move straight to the parking structure. Yes. And if it is not clear, then we move quickly and we do not stop. He held her gaze. Can you run in what you are wearing? She looked down at herself. The heels had come off hours ago. She had set them under the chair sometime around the second pour of scotch. She was in bare feet on a concrete floor. I can run, she said. Stay behind me, not beside me, behind. His voice had shifted into something operational, stripped of everything except the information that mattered. If I stop, you stop. If I move, you move. If I tell you to go, you go, and you do not look back to check on me. Are we clear? She wanted to argue the last part. The part of her that had spent 9 years being no one's definition of a passive participant in any situation wanted to push back on the instruction to run without looking back. But she looked at his face, the controlled certainty of it, the absence of anything personal in the instruction, and understood that this was not about her capability. It was about the arithmetic of a narrow corridor, and the things that happened in them when people made decisions based on sentiment rather than geometry. Clear, she said. He moved to the secondary door. She fell in behind him, close enough to move when he moved, far enough not to crowd his reaction space. She knew that much from enough conflict-adjacent reporting to have learned the basics. He put his hand flat on the door, looked back at her once. She gave him a single nod. He pushed the door open slowly, and the corridor beyond exhaled into the room, cooler, darker, and entirely still in the way that could mean safety or could mean something was waiting in it with the patience of people who had been told their target had nowhere to go. She followed him through, and the door swung shut behind her, and the bunker, the sealed amber room where they had traded truths and scotch, and the kind of honesty that only surfaces when all the usual exits are gone, became part of the night they were leaving behind. Whatever was ahead of them in that corridor, they were walking into it together. The corridor was clear. That was the first thing. It was also, as it turned out, the last good thing for a while. They moved through it quickly and without speaking, Cillian ahead, torch low, Cathy 3 feet behind him with her hand trailing the wall for orientation in the narrow dark. The utility sublevel branch passed on their left, sealed and silent. The corridor bent right. The smell changed, from recycled air to something older and more open, the particular cold of underground concrete that has regular exposure to the outside world. The parking structure. They were close. Cillian slowed, raised his left hand flat, palm back. She stopped instantly. He held that position for 5 full seconds, head slightly tilted, reading something in the dark ahead that she could not yet access. Then he clicked the torch off entirely, and the darkness became total and immediate and very serious. She heard it a moment after he did. Footsteps, more than one set, moving with the deliberate, spread formation of people who were not lost and not hurrying because they did not need to hurry. They had the exits. They knew it. The footsteps had the unhurried quality of a closing net. Cillian's hand found her arm in the dark and pulled her sideways into a shallow alcove she had not seen. A maintenance recess, barely wide enough for 2 people standing closer together than was comfortable. She pressed her back against the wall. He pressed in beside her, and the space required that there be no distance between them, which under any other circumstances would have been a different kind of conversation entirely. She counted 4 separate sets of footsteps as they passed the corridor entrance, then a 5th, slower, further back, then voices low, clipped, in a dialect she half recognized as Southern Italian. She caught 3 words clearly. She wished she had not, because one of them was her name. She felt Cillian go very still beside her in a way that was different from his usual stillness. This was not the controlled quiet of a man thinking. This was the particular stillness of a man who had just heard something that changed his calculation and was deciding, in real time, what to do about it. The footsteps moved through and past. The voices faded. Neither of them moved for another full 30 seconds, which felt considerably longer than 30 seconds. Then he pulled her forward, through the corridor's final turn, and the parking structure opened around them, low-ceilinged, mostly empty at this hour. Lit by overhead fluorescents that buzzed and flickered with the commitment of something that had been meaning to fail for a long time. The vehicle ramp was visible at the far end. 60 feet, maybe 70. Open ground with very little between them and it. And 4 men between them and it, standing in a loose configuration that covered the ramp's entrance with the professional thoroughness of people who had been placed there rather than wandered there. One of them saw Cillian at approximately the same moment Cillian saw him. The next several seconds were loud and extremely unpleasant. Cillian moved her behind a concrete pillar with one hand and put himself on the outside of it before she had processed that they were no longer walking. She heard 2 shots, controlled, precise, nothing like the chaos of the ballroom, and when she looked around the pillar, one of the 4 men was no longer standing, and a second was moving differently than he had been a moment ago. But there were more coming from the left corridor now. She could hear them. The net she had felt closing in the dark was closing faster. "Cathy," Cillian's voice came from the other side of the pillar, still operational, still stripped of everything except information. "Behind you, left wall, there is a yellow service door approximately 15 feet back." She looked, there was. "I see it. It opens onto a maintenance tunnel that runs beneath the north side of the building. 40 meters in, it surfaces through a utility hatch on the pavement outside." He fired twice more, measured, deliberate. "Go." She did not move. "Come with me." "I cannot hold this position and move at the same time." He said it with the flat arithmetic of someone reporting a fact, not making a choice. "If I move, and they reach the tunnel before you are through it. Then we both go now, immediately." "There are 11 men in this structure." He said it quietly, beneath another exchange of fire that echoed off the concrete ceiling like something enormous. "I have counted them. If I am in that tunnel with you, 11 men follow us into a space 40 meters long with one exit." A pause in which she heard him reload with the efficiency of someone who had done it under worse conditions. "If I stay, 11 men stay with me." She understood the mathematics. She understood it completely and hated every single integer of it. That is not a plan. That is a different kind of sealed room. It is a plan that gets you out of the building. His voice had not changed. Not its tone, not its pace, not the quality of certainty underneath it. "Which is the only plan I have that I can guarantee." "Cillian." "There is no version of this conversation," he said quietly. "That ends with me walking into that tunnel, so stop arguing and move. A beat, please." It was the please that undid her. Not because it was soft, it was not soft. It was the please of a man who did not use the word and meant it entirely, spoken with a controlled urgency that said everything his composed face would never let her see directly. She looked at the service door. She looked at the back of his head around the edge of the pillar, the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself even now with that deliberate, managed steadiness that she had spent all night slowly understanding was not arrogance. It had never been arrogance. It was the posture of a man who had decided, a very long time ago, that the only thing he had left to protect was other people's ability to walk away. She pushed off the wall, crossed the 15 feet to the service door, pushed it open. The tunnel beyond was dark and low and smelled of damp concrete and old pipework. She stepped through, looked back. He had not turned around. He was exactly where she had left him, steady and deliberate against the pillar, holding 11 men in place with the particular, terrible competence of someone who had made a decision and was seeing it through without any further discussion. The door was on a slow, hydraulic hinge. It was going to close whether she held it or not. She let it close. She turned into the dark of the tunnel and she ran, not because she had accepted his plan, because there was one thing Cillian Pisani did not know that she did. She knew this city. Every layout, every corridor, every street that connected to every other street. She had spent 9 years mapping it for a living. And she knew exactly where this tunnel surfaced, and exactly which phone box was 3 doors from that hatch, and exactly which frequency she needed to reach the 2 men currently holding a stairwell inside this building. She was not running away. She was running toward something. There was a difference. The difference mattered to her even now, even in the dark, even with her bare feet on wet concrete and her heart doing something that had nothing to do with the sprint. She ran faster. The hatch surfaced exactly where she knew it would. A utility panel set flush into the pavement on Caro Street, north side, between a closed dry cleaner and a phone box that the city had not yet gotten around to removing despite the fact that nobody had used it for anything legitimate in a decade. She knew this because she had written a piece 2 years ago about the city's dying public infrastructure, and she had stood on this exact pavement taking notes and thinking about nothing except column inches. She thought about that now, the strange, lateral way that information stored itself, waiting in the back of the mind for the specific moment it became necessary. She pushed the hatch up with both palms and climbed out into the night air. Cold, sharp, the kind of air that hits bare feet on winter pavement like a correction. She barely felt it. The street was quiet in the way that streets near active incidents go quiet, people inside, curtains shifted, the particular urban stillness of a neighborhood that has heard something and decided, collectively, that the inside of a building was the correct response. 2 blocks south, she could see the blue oscillation of police lights. They had arrived then. Late, as they tended to when the address in question was associated with a name like Pisani. Not from negligence exactly, but from the institutional caution of a department that had learned to assess the situation thoroughly before committing to a position on it. She did not go toward the police lights. She turned north. The phone box was unlocked, as they always were, and still connected, as they sometimes were. She lifted the receiver. A dial tone, thin and slightly indignant, like something that had not expected to be disturbed. She pressed the recall button twice, then dialed from memory a number she had written in the inside cover of her notebook 3 months ago next to the notation. Emergency use, not for publication. It rang 4 times. Then a voice, clipped, cautious, the voice of a man answering a number he did not recognize at an hour that warranted suspicion. "I need Ray's," she said. "Tell him it is the journalist. Tell him the parking structure, north entrance, service level. Tell him Cillian is holding 11 men alone and the clock is running." She paused. "Tell him I said the debt from the Caro Street story is due. He will know what that means." A silence on the line. Then, "Where are you now?" 3 doors from the north hatch on Caro. "I am not moving until I know someone is moving first." Another silence, shorter. "Stay on the line." She stayed on the line. She pressed her back against the glass of the phone box and looked up at the building from the outside for the first time since the night had collapsed into something unrecognizable. The Belmont Grand looked entirely normal from out here, which struck her as genuinely offensive. Buildings should look different on the outside when something irreversible is happening inside them. They never did. 3 months ago, she had obtained and published leaked documentation linking a city councilor to a series of fraudulent demolition permits that had conveniently cleared 2 blocks of residential property for a development company connected, at several removes, to Cillian's organization. The story had won her a commendation she had not collected yet. What it had also done, as an unintended consequence, was give a man named Ray's, one of Cillian's longest-serving and most quietly capable lieutenants, a documented reason to be 300 miles away from the city on the night those permits were traced back to their source. The alibi had been accidental on her part. Ray's had understood what it was worth anyway. She had filed the moment away under complicated, which was the folder in her professional conscience, where she put the things that did not fit neatly into the version of journalism she had described in her university application. "We have men 2 blocks out," the voice came back. "Ray's is already moving." "North parking entrance, service level." She kept her voice even. "There is a mole in the organization. Someone with staff access codes gave the Varro Syndicate the ventilation override sequence. Cillian does not know who yet, but he knows it is internal." A pause. "How do you know that?" "Because I was in the room when he worked it out." She straightened. "Move fast. He is buying time, not infinite time." She hung up, stood for a moment on the cold pavement with her bare feet and her ruined evening dress and 4 months of notes she no longer knew what to do with. Then she started moving, not away, but in a wide arc around the building's north perimeter, toward the vehicle ramp entrance, because she had told Ray's where to go, but she had not told herself to stay put, and staying put had never once in her life been something she was built for. She reached the ramp entrance from the outside just as 3 vehicles came fast and quiet around the corner from the east, dark, unmarked, moving with the coordinated speed of people who had been told exactly where to go and had not wasted time getting there. They went down the ramp without stopping. She counted the men who went with them. It was enough. She knew it was enough. She waited. She was good at waiting when the waiting was for something specific. It was the open-ended kind she had no tolerance for. 4 minutes. Then gunfire inside, brief, concentrated, nothing like the sprawling chaos of the ballroom. The kind of gunfire that has a beginning and a middle and a definitive end. Then silence. Then footsteps on the ramp, coming up. Cillian came out of the parking structure on his feet, which was the first thing she checked. He was moving carefully, conscious of his ribs, one hand resting on Ray's shoulder with the ease of long familiarity rather than the need for support. His jacket was gone. His shirt was worse than it had been. He was otherwise entirely himself, composed, contained, and carrying the specific expression of a man who had just run a calculation that had not been supposed to come out in his favor, and was still in the process of understanding that it had. He saw her standing on the pavement. He stopped. She watched him take her in bare feet, wrecked dress, phone box 3 doors behind her, and understand in the sequencing that she could see moving behind his eyes exactly what she had done and how she had done it. The route she had run, the calls she had made, the debt she had spent on his behalf. He said nothing for a long moment. The street was quiet. Ray's and the others moved with practiced discretion back toward the vehicles, allowing the space between Cillian and Cathy, the privacy it had apparently decided it required. "You did not go to the police," he said. "No. You had every reason to." "I had several reasons." She held his gaze steadily. "I chose a different one." He studied her face with the focused, measuring attention that she had once found opaque and now found simply honest. A man reading a situation as it actually was rather than as he expected it to be. "That was a significant professional decision to make in under 10 minutes, he said. "I am a fast writer." She said it without a smile. Then, because it was the truth and she had decided in the tunnel that she was done with any version of this that required her to be less than honest. "I was not going to let you die in a car park for 11 men, Cillian. That was never going to be how this ended." The thing that moved across his face then was not the brief, managed flicker she had been cataloging all night. It was slower than that, more complete. The expression of a man encountering something he had stopped expecting to encounter and had therefore stopped preparing a defense against. "You understand," he said quietly, "that you have just made yourself very difficult to walk away from." "I know," she looked at him. "I am choosing not to consider that a problem." A silence settled between them, not the heavy, pressurized quiet of the bunker, but something different, something that had room in it. Ray's said something low from near the vehicles. Cillian answered him without looking away from her, 3 words she did not catch, and she heard the vehicles begin to move. He took 1 step toward her, then stopped, looked down at her bare feet on the cold pavement. "You have no shoes," he said. "I am aware." He removed his jacket, the one Ray's had apparently retrieved from somewhere inside, and held it out. She took it. It was warm in the way things are warm when they have been close to a person for a long time, and it smelled of expensive fabric and something underneath that was simply him, and she put it on without comment because the night had already cost both of them enough performance of indifference. "Come," he said. "We have a great deal to discuss, and I would prefer to do it somewhere with a floor that is not a car park." She fell into step beside him, not behind, beside. He did not correct it. The office was on the 14th floor of a building that did not have Cillian's name anywhere on its exterior, which she had always found instructive. The most powerful rooms in any city were almost never the ones with signage. She had written that in her notebook once, early in the investigation, thinking it was about architecture. She understood now that it was about people. The office itself had not survived the night intact. The Varro syndicate had reached it before Cillian's men had secured the upper floors. Drawers pulled, files disturbed. A glass panel along the east wall cracked cleanly from corner to corner, in a way that suggested something had been thrown against it with considerable force. The desk was overturned. The lamp that had presumably once sat on it was in 3 pieces near the window. Whoever had come through here had been looking for something specific and had not been careful about the looking. Cillian stood in the doorway for a moment, taking stock of it the way he took stock of everything, without visible reaction, reading the scene for information rather than feeling. Then he righted the desk himself, which she noticed he did not ask anyone else to do, and set the lamp pieces on the windowsill, and pulled the chair back to its position with the quiet, methodical composure of a man who understood that putting a room back together was sometimes the only available response to the fact that it had been taken apart. Reyes and the others were in the lower floors. The building was secured. Outside, the city continued in its ordinary, indifferent way, entirely unaware that something that had taken 11 years to construct had nearly come apart in a single night, and that the thing which had held it together in the end was a journalist in bare feet standing in a phone box on Caro Street. Cathy sat in the chair across from the righted desk. Her notebook was on her knee. She had been carrying it all night, through the ballroom, through the corridor, through the bunker, through the tunnel. The habit of a journalist was apparently more durable than most things. She looked at it now. 4 months of notes. Dates, names, cross-referenced financial records, source testimony, and somewhere in the middle section, a page where the entries had shifted gradually from evidentiary to something she had not had an honest word for at the time. She had one now. She stood up, crossed to the window. The city spread below in its familiar geometry, the grid she knew by memory, the streets she had walked for 9 years collecting other people's truths and assembling them into something printable. She thought about the piece she had been building, the headline, the citations, the neat, devastating arc of an exposé that would have defined her career and ended his. She thought about a 22-year-old standing at a graveside in Salerno. She thought about a bottle of scotch with a faded paper tag. She thought about 2 words spoken quietly across a dark room that had not expected to be the most honest thing she heard all year. She tore the first page out and held it to the lamp on the windowsill that was not currently functional, then reconsidered and crossed to the small emergency candle Reyes had left burning on the filing cabinet. She touched the corner of the page to the flame. It caught cleanly. She let it burn down to her fingers, then she tore out the next page. She had burned 6 pages before she heard him come back into the room. He stopped behind her. She did not turn around. She touched page 7 to the candle and watched it take. "What are you doing?" He said it without inflection, not a demand, not an accusation. A genuine question from a man who had stopped assuming he knew the answer to things where she was concerned. "What it looks like," she said. A silence. He came to stand beside her at the filing cabinet. Close enough to see the pages clearly. His name in her handwriting, dates, figures, the architecture of everything she had spent 4 months constructing around him. He watched a page with 3 names on it curl and blacken and reduce itself to nothing without making any move to stop her. "That is your work," he said. "Yes. 4 months of it. I am aware of how long it took." She turned the next page in her fingers. "I was there for all of it." He was quiet for a moment. "Cathy!" He said her name the way he had said it in the bunker, without management, without the careful professional distance he wrapped around everything else. "You do not have to do this." She stopped, turned to look at him properly for the first time since they had come into the room. He was standing in the candlelight with his wrecked shirt and his dressed ribs and the specific expression of a man who had spent 11 years making sure that no decision made on his behalf was ever made out of obligation, and who had just found himself entirely unable to enforce that preference. "I know I do not have to," she said. "That is what makes it a choice." He looked at the notebook in her hands, then at her face. "The story you were writing did not have a soul." She said it plainly, without sentiment, the way she said the things she had decided were simply true. "I was writing about a structure, an empire, a ledger with your name at the top." She looked at him steadily. "I was not writing about you. I did not know you well enough to write about you." She touched the next page to the flame. "I know you better now." "And what you know," he said carefully, is worth more to you than the story. What I know, she said, is the story. It is just not one I can print. She watched the page go. The version I was writing was accurate in every fact and wrong in every conclusion. That is the worst kind of wrong there is. I have spent 9 years trying not to write that kind of piece. She set the remainder of the notebook on the filing cabinet and looked at it. I am not going to start now. He was quiet for a long moment. The candle held its small, steady light between them. Outside, the city turned its ordinary wheel, indifferent and continuous, the way it always had. You understand what staying means, he said. Not a question. He was too careful for that. It was the statement of a man who needed to be certain that she had read every line of what she was signing, because he was not the kind of person who let anyone walk into his world on the basis of incomplete information. It is not a simple life. It is not a clean one. I have been chasing the clean version of things for 9 years, she said. I have never once found it. Not in a courtroom, not in a source, not in a verdict, not in a headline. She looked at him. Clean is not real. I am tired of writing about a world that does not exist. Something settled in his face, not softness exactly, because that was not a word that would ever be accurate for him, but a quality of arrival. The expression of a man reaching the end of a very long resistance and finding, on the other side of it, something he had not allowed himself to expect. He picked up the remaining pages of the notebook from the filing cabinet and held them to the candle himself. They burned together in the small space between them, 4 months of evidence, of careful work, of a version of Cillian Pisani that had been accurate about everything except the part that mattered most. The smoke rose and thinned and went to nothing. When the last page was gone, he set the notebook cover down and looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes that she had spent a night learning to read anyway. The story you know, he said quietly. The one you cannot print, what does it say? She considered the question the way she considered all questions worth answering, honestly, from the beginning, without reaching for the convenient version. It says that the most dangerous men are not the ones without conscience. She held his gaze. They are the ones who have one, and have spent years trying to outrun it. A pause. It says that the truth I was looking for was not in your ledger. She looked at him. It was in the choice to trust someone who had every reason not to be trusted. And to be trusted by someone who had every reason not to give it. The city moved outside the cracked window. Somewhere below, Reyes was managing the details of a night that would need considerable managing. The candle burned its quiet inch. The office smelled of smoke and old paper, and the particular, settling quiet of something that had been decided. Cillian looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something she had not seen him do once in the entire length of the night. He let his face be completely still, not the controlled stillness of a man managing his expression, but the genuine stillness of one who had stopped needing to. Stay, he said, one word, unadorned, the most unguarded thing she had heard from him. She looked at the ash on the filing cabinet. She looked at the cracked window and the city beyond it, the city she had spent 9 years mapping and thought she understood, and was now not entirely sure she had ever seen clearly. I am already staying, she said. I made that decision in a tunnel on Caro Street. He said nothing further. He did not need to. He simply moved to the desk, righted the second chair, and set it beside the first, not across from it, beside it. And that small, quiet adjustment said everything that either of them had left to say. She sat, he sat. The candle burned between them, small and steady, the way honest things burn when they have finally been allowed to. Outside, the city carried on. Inside, in a room that smelled of smoke and decisions, 2 people who had spent a very long night dismantling every careful wall they had built sat together in the ruins of what they had each thought they knew, and found, in the space where those walls had been, something neither of them had a clean word for yet. They had time to find one.